Good morning. My name is Cassidy, and I am part of the Edges community here. It is an honor to lead our conversation this morning, knowing that together we have both the courage and the desire to talk about some really big topics going on in the world around us. This is the third week of our series called Good News. It is kind of a year-long journey. We started back in August, where we're trying to do our best to hold on to what is good in a world that the good can sometimes be hard to find. So, of course, the question becomes, how do we do this? How do we deal with the news and yet stay hopeful, inspired, and joyful? How do we figure out how we as a church can do what we can do to possibly be a place for good news amidst all of the headlines? So we're hoping that maybe by taking on some of the topics that together we can find God and the good news already at work. So this week I thought we would take on a topic that is so pervasive in the news that there are actually organizations who are dedicated just to collecting all the headlines and news stories related to the topic in one place and posting that to be found every week. The thing is, though, it's also kind of a topic that many of us, gloss over, ignore, or sometimes just don't even notice, which I think is kind of indicative of why it might be worth talking about together this morning. So here are just some of the headlines collected by some of these resources just from the last couple weeks. Things like 2016 voting sites lacked full disability access, or several articles about disability hate crimes, some disability discrimination and how we ignore it. There were quite a few about large retailers, many settling ADA violation lawsuits, and some new survey results revealing that there's a gap in supporting employees with disabilities. And that is just a quick snapshot of disability and news about it, headlines that have just been present in the last couple weeks just in the United States. And according to the Census Bureau in the United States, about 1 in 5, so about 20% of the population identifies as having a disability. In fact, if that 20% was formally recognized as a minority, it would be the largest minority group in the United States. Disability is pretty diverse, and I think it's diverse starting just with the language that we use to describe both the people and the conditions that we're talking about. Disability and handicapped are often used interchangeably, though, and they are the most widely accepted, but a lot of that just depends on the person. So some prefer maybe disability to handicap, other people prefer to use terms maybe like differently abled, but in general, there are many choices and preferences out there, and your best bet is always just to ask. For the sake of today, I'm going to use disability just for simplicity and for clarity. So my closest friend is the mother of a young girl who has an extra chromosome. She has a developmental disability called Down syndrome. Now, in my friend's case, she didn't know about the existence of this extra chromosome before her daughter's birth. So I always think about, if we can imagine, kind of what that hospital room felt like for her. All the anticipation and excitement as the moment of meeting her daughter was growing near. You know, the room is sort of a buzz with all the energy. The doctor, the nurses were all there. And in that moment, the baby arrives. Tears of joy are shed, smiles passed around the room, and everybody is just excited with this new birth. But then you start to imagine the moment when the nurses caring for the new baby girl grow a little silent and seem worried. Whispers start to be exchanged, more doctors get called in, eventually tests are run, and the verdict is in that her precious daughter has Down syndrome. And for some reason, every moment that followed that one felt different. People started to apologize to her for the bad news, saying that they were sorry to hear about her daughter's diagnosis. I just think, bad news? A mom finally gets handed her long-awaited daughter, and the world around her hesitates almost to celebrate with her. Instead, society seems to label these circumstances as bad news. So I have two other friends who have similar stories. Both were diagnosed with cancer as children. They underwent extensive treatment, and they eventually concluded their treatments and are now declared cancer-free. So those are incredible victories and really good news. But as byproducts of the disease, a direct result of what cancer did to their bodies, One is now a wheelchair user with a variety of health challenges, and the other is an amputee. I mean, certainly this is not probably the reality that any of us would choose for ourselves or friends or family members, but all of a sudden they and their parents had to face a world with this new reality. And they found a society and culture that often affirmed their acquired disabilities as bad news. And they were thrown into a world where they were, and still are, often defined by what they couldn't do instead of what they could. So many of the news headlines only seem to reinforce these ideas. The otherness of those with disabilities, or the difficulty in creating environments that are wholly inclusive. The experience of my friends regularly matches the kind of things I read in surveys and articles, that the day-to-day challenges can be shocking at times, between lack of access and information in public spaces to lack of opportunities in the workplace. It's all part and parcel of being in a society that either fails to include them or views them as an afterthought. But what is probably the most painful is often the ability of culture to simply turn a blind eye, which is kind of a seemingly appropriate idiom. What happens more often than anything else is that those with disabilities are often treated as invisible or even incompetent. I saw this firsthand several times over the last few years. So someone very important to me passed away a few weeks ago, and just last weekend we honored him with a service. He was my coach in college, and coach just doesn't really grasp the depth of what he meant to me. Juice, as we affectionately called him, he was a mentor and a friend and a father figure. And he was also a double amputee at the time of his death, losing one leg about a decade ago and the other one just a few years later. After the first surgery, I helped Juice figure out how to make his split-level home more accessible. He learned how to drive an adaptive vehicle, and he kept working and coaching and traveling just as he'd always done. He attributed much of his ability to keep on keeping on to being able to use a prosthetic, because with it, his disability wasn't immediately evident to the general public. But after a second surgery, he needed a wheelchair full-time, and I noticed that things for him started to change. He was always really honest about it, as he was about everything, and a lot of his observations boiled down to this simple thought. He did not, in his mind, have a disability. He would often say, "It's just a leg," but he felt disabled in nearly every environment that he encountered. One of the recent news stories, the headlines echoed this exact idea. Writer was Jonathan Mooney. He wrote an October piece for the New York Times. It was titled, "You Are Special, Now Stop Being Different." And in it, Mooney, who's the co-founder of a national advocacy organization for people with learning disabilities, he said this: "He experienced disability in environments that could not accommodate and embrace my differences. Ability and disability is not a fact in the world, but a social construct, a transactional reality created by public policy, professional power, and everything in between." Now, I don't specialize in public policy or professional power, and I know that the issues of access and opportunities are likely layers deep and filled with red tape. But as I reflected on my coach's life last week, I found myself thinking this. He spent the last decade trying to live in and contribute to a society that said to him nearly every day that because of his new reality, he no longer had a full seat at the table. So you know that expression, right? Seat at the table, where the table is kind of symbolic of power or of credibility, and that having a seat at the table indicates that you have the opportunity to be heard and to make a difference. Juice had that for 58 years of his life, a place at the table and recognition as a whole person in society. But a change in his actual physical body took that away from him, and his experience with disability wasn't even for a lifetime, as it is for many. And his also was only physical, where it may be physical, cognitive, and more for others as well. But this idea that everyone has a seat at the table seems to me like the perfect representation of the story or the headline that God would write. And he did, and we'll find it in 2 Samuel chapter 9. But before we flip there, I want to set the stage for you a little bit with a little bit of context. Saul was the king of Israel, and he was very threatened by this other guy, David. In fact, he actually tried to kill David on several occasions just to get him out of the kingdom, but he never succeeded, partially because of his own son, Saul's son, Jonathan, who often stood up for David. So when Saul died in battle, David became the new king of Israel. At the time, it would have been customary to extinguish all members of a previous dynasty to ensure and prevent them from laying claim to the throne. So people would have expected David, the new king, to call for all the descendants of Saul to be killed. So instead, we're going to see what David did, and that's in 2 Samuel 9, like I mentioned, and you'll find that on page 180 of the Bibles on your table, but I will note that I am going to summarize a bit, so you might find it easier just to listen along. So 2 Samuel 9, starting in verse 1. One day, David thought, I wonder if any of Saul's family are still alive. If they are, I will be kind to them because I made a promise to Jonathan. So David calls in a servant, Ziba, to ask if anyone in Saul's family is still alive. And Ziba answers this in verse 3 and says, one of Jonathan's sons is still alive, but he can't walk. David hears this and asks where he lives. And then he sends some servants to go bring Jonathan's son, Mephibosheth, to him. We actually learn about Mephibosheth earlier in 2 Samuel. In chapter 4, we learn that Mephibosheth had been disabled since he was a young boy. So here again, now in chapter 9, David's servants go out and find this boy, now a man, Mephibosheth, and they discover him to be living in obscurity and in poverty. These servants carried him to David, where he knelt before him in reverence and in fear. And in verse 7, David says, don't be afraid. I'll be kind to you because Jonathan was your father. I'm going to give you back the land that belonged to your grandfather Saul. Besides that, you will always eat with me at my table. In verse 8, Mephibosheth responds, why should you care about me? I'm worth no more than a dead dog. And then David took it one step further. He actually called his servant Ziba back in, and he said this, Mephibosheth would be given everything that belonged to his grandfather, the former king Saul, including the land and the crops, so that their family would be fed. But then he declared, again in verse 10, Mephibosheth will always eat with me at my table. And in verse 13, he says it again. He concludes, Mephibosheth could not walk on either foot, but he lived in Jerusalem and ate at David's table, just like one of David's own sons. So for me, reading about David's actions and attitudes toward Mephibosheth led me to wonder about how this story would translate to modern day. So I thought maybe it was something we should consider together in groups this morning. What can we deduce about the character traits of David from this story? And with those character traits in mind, what actions do we see David take? So we're going to gather together with maybe 4 or 6 other folks, and you'll take about 3 minutes to discuss these questions. They'll be on the screen. Take a moment to introduce yourselves, and just know that all are welcome to talk or listen, whichever feels best to you. And I'll call you back together in about 3 minutes. All right, if you want to finish up your last thought, and then we'll come back together. So, share one more thing. Thinking about David and who he was. If you want to come back together, we'll talk about this a moment just as a group. So it's a pretty short story, this 2 Samuel chapter 9 passage, and I found myself thinking about it this week and thinking about what kind of example a modern-day David could be, both to me and the church. So I'd like to talk about this together. So first, if you want to share just those one-word traits, what do you see David exhibiting here in this story? Call them out. Humility. Compassion. Courageous. Non-conformative. Trusting. Restorative. Respect. How about one more? Things we see in David. Integrity. And then taking these traits we see David exhibiting, what do we see him do as a result? So if you've got a short snippet that your group discussed and want to share and call those out, what were the actions that were taken as a result of who David was? Yeah, if you could hear Luke, he was willing to go against the tradition of that time in the name of compassion. What else? He used his power for something positive. He understood God's mercy. One more. Yeah, he discerned the need that Mephibosheth had. And good job on Mephibosheth. That's quite a name. So, in hearing all this, seeing how David acted in this story, it made me think, sometimes I find it difficult to really fully care about an issue that I'm not personally connected to. And you may feel similarly sometimes, or maybe with different topics we've talked about in this series. But in this short story alone, we just see David. We see him go make a personal connection, one that actually crossed some socially constructed boundaries. He reached out, right? He reached out to Mephibosheth when everything about the culture at the time would have kept him from doing so. Not only was it a demonstration of the love and acceptance of God that God had extended toward David, but it literally gave Mephibosheth a seat at the table. And it wasn't just any table, right? It was the table of the king. So one summer during college, I had a big internship. I helped coordinate a large-scale Christian youth gathering. And my specific role was actually to help facilitate kind of a pre-gathering event. And the event was called DALE, which was an acronym for the Definitely Abled Youth Leadership Event. It was at this event that I met my friend Sarah. Sarah, I mentioned earlier, she's a cancer survivor and now a wheelchair user. And she's also now a pastor, and she is now the leader of this gathering, which coincidentally has changed its name to The Table. Sarah wrote these words to describe the why of the table gathering. a sense of belonging is not always a truth that the world and culture extend. We continuously wonder, where do I fit in? Why am I different than others? What gifts could I possibly bring? And yet we are reminded in Psalm 139, I am fearfully and wonderfully made. We are made wonderfully by the very God who names us and claims us as children. We belong to God. At the table, we believe in the promise that we all, and therefore you, belong to God at Christ's table, within the church, and within our communities. So, there are some news stories out there that are delivering on this good news. And 2 recent headlines came up from the apparel industry that you might have even seen. Last year, the major apparel brand Tommy Hilfiger actually released an adaptive clothing line for children. And just a few weeks ago, Target announced that their Cat and Jack brand of clothing was being expanded to also include designs for children with disabilities. These brands are essentially offering seats at the table. They are telling kids that they belong in the same prints, the same styles, the same patterns, the same colors that their peers are wearing. And that whatever their special conditions require, that they can be accommodated. And they can be accommodated at the same price points and in the same stores. Now, I'm certain that the lines are not comprehensive yet for every child with a disability, but it's a start. Plus, the Hilfiger line just recently announced that they're expanding this into adult apparel as well. The founder of the clothing line for Tommy Hilfiger, Mindy Shire, she explained this as her why. Clothing can empower, clothing can create confidence, and clothing can make a difference. And if we believe, and I do, that clothing can send this message, how much more powerful would it be coming from the church? So at my coach's funeral, I actually had the chance to catch up with a lot of friends and teammates, and one in particular, Dania. She is a lawyer and disability rights advocate in Washington, D.C. While chatting at our favorite lunch college spot before the service, I asked Dania her thoughts on how our church could have a conversation about disability that honored those who identify as disabled and honored the true good news about God. I told her what I thought God was stirring up in me, this idea that we, the church, can be intentional about the full inclusion of all God's children at the table, and even more so that we can be living headlines or walking billboards for the good news message that you, all of you, with all of your differing abilities, you're all good news, and you're a child of God, created and loved by God, and that you belong. And here's what Dania said. She said, and you don't just belong, you enhance. David believed it to be so about Mephibosheth. So how can we become more like David? How can I? And how can our church? So this week, as we do our best to hold on to what is good, maybe we can hold on to that idea together. Amen.